Yeah, well, dreams are very interesting because I think they are necessary, and we know a lot about the necessity of REM sleep for health, and so there's no question that dreams are doing good things for us. But they also are an experience of stark psychosis. You know, I mean, they are a condition. Unless we're talking about lucid dreaming, this is a circumstance where you really have no idea what's going on. I mean, you are in reality asleep in your bed, and yet you have transitioned into another experience, where the laws of nature are violated. You're talking to dead people. The sky is the limit, right? And you're not even surprised. You're doing so little reality testing. You're not even surprised about these changes. You have so little purchase on who you were just 15 minutes ago when you went to sleep that it's so. I mean,
it does mean to some degree at that point, though, that you have suspended your unthinking identification with your daytime propositional thought.
Yeah, but in the normal case, you're identified with your dream body and your dream persona and whoever you've become. I mean, you're being terrorized in a more malleable,
right. The identity problem is still there.
Yeah,
it's just it's more random and less logically coherent. And there's something there about exploration and change of categories themselves that's going on. But I can see your point about it still being part of that.
And more to the point, there's actually a very close connection between what happens with ordinary thought and dreaming. So, for instance, ordinary thinking is, in my view, ordinary identification with thought. I don't mean to demonize thought per se, because we need thoughts, and the goal of meditation is not to get rid of thoughts; it's to be able to recognize them as what they are, and to recognize the process of thinking, and to break this pseudo identification with it. But the identification with thought is very much analogous to dreaming and not knowing that you're dreaming. And the switch from a normal dream to a lucid dream is analogous to the kind of waking up in the middle of life that I'm advocating here, where you can actually just recognize thoughts as thoughts. And there's something that the way in which thoughts steal over us, where it's like you're trying to pay attention to something, and then all of a sudden you're replaying an argument that you had with your wife, yesterday, right? And helplessly, and it's actually it's dredging up the emotion that is appropriate to that argument, right? So now you're getting angry or regretful or whatever it is. It's quite crazy. It's totally normal. I mean, this is the default state of most people most of the time. But given how unhappy the character of our conversation is with ourselves most of the time, given that the stories we're telling ourselves are less than perfectly inspiring and perfectly ennobling and great, opening us to great reservoirs of compassion and wisdom, right? They're not doing that. It's worth looking into this. And it does have this dreamlike character of both coming out of nowhere and completely seizing the reins of attention and identity and taking us elsewhere. And also, we forget it. It has a.
That's part of the totalitarian spirit of rationality, that proclivity.
Well, but but a lot of these thoughts aren't rational. It's just you're just rehearsing your experience. It's just like, you'll tell yourself the same thing 10 times in a row, and you won't be bored on the 10th time. You'll like, if you just imagine what it would be like to externalize your thoughts on a loudspeaker for everyone to listen to, and it was just helplessly, externalized. Every normal person would sound insane, because of the perseveration and just the redundancy and the strange structure to the discursiveness. I mean, this is this is ever present. It's so ever present that it doesn't strike people as strange, but to be presuming we have a dialogue with ourselves as though the I could talk to the me, and that made any sense at all. It's like, I'm sitting here and you're getting set up for this interview, right? And I'll think, oh, I got to get some water, right? Now, I know if I'm the one to say it, and I'm the one to hear it. Right? I know I need water. Who am I telling?
Yeah.
It's like I'm telling someone else, right, who needs to be informed about this.
Well, you're probably telling the prefrontal cortex, and it tells the motor cortex. So, that's probably the hypothalamus talking to the prefrontal cortex because it doesn't have direct output over the motor cortex. It's something like that.
It remains to be seen whether any of that is actually functionally necessary. But I think for the most part, it's not. I mean, for the most part, we simply talk to. It's almost like we started talking to our parents. Once my language is incredibly useful, as you know, and it is what defines us as people in many respects. And once it once it gets tuned up, it never shuts off. We're talking to, first we're pre-linguistic and we're just drinking in language that's aimed at us, all the time. Our parents are jabbering to us. We begin to understand what they're saying, as so much of it is, indexical. They're pointing to things and we're naming those things. We're hearing the sounds associated with the things that are being grasped and handed to us. And soon we begin to participate in this language game in ways that we're not conscious of. And once this gets tuned up, we talk to our parents, we jabber to our parents incessantly, and then we jabber to ourselves when they leave the room. And it never stops.
Well,
right?
Ian McGilchrist and I have talked about this issue, and he's of the opinion, I hope I'm not misrepresenting him, and it's an idea that I had shared to some degree, is that the right hemisphere, in many ways, this is in left-handed people at least, in some sense is more regulated by the underlying limbic structures, the motivational structures, like an animal is. And the left hemisphere, to the degree that it's linguistic, it inhibits those right hemisphere functions tonically. And that's likely speech. And what that implies, perhaps, is that if you can shut that speech off, there's a different mode of perception that's characterized by the right hemisphere's immersement in these underlying motivational systems that might be part and parcel of that revivification possibility that I think you're pointing to as something that lies outside the linguistic landscape. And that can become maybe hyperdominant, has become hyperdominant in us because we're so immersed in language.
I mean, from what I can tell, I mean, thus far, the research on the neuroimaging research on meditation is, still in its infancy, despite the fact that there have been hundreds and even thousands of papers at this point on meditation. But, silencing the default mode network is certainly part of the footprint of the change here that is relevant. And the default mode network, for people, I mean, many people have heard of this by now, but it used to be kind of an esoteric topic. But just a brief review, the default mode network is called the default mode because it was noticed in virtually every neuroimaging experiment ever designed that there was this system of structures in the midline of the brain that would increase their activity in between tasks. So whatever the paradigm was, if you're giving people a reading task or a sensory task or a memory task or visual discrimination, whatever it is, you're putting them in the scanner, they have to pay attention to something. In those epochs between tasks, when they were no longer having to pay attention to something, they're waiting for the next thing to be presented to them, these set of structures in the midline would increase their activity. And so it was called the default mode. It's just the brain's idling state. But these are also the structures that seem to have a disproportionate amount of responsibility for self-reference and self-representation, and they get tuned up even further when you give people tasks that require a retrospective analysis of the self. If I gave you a list of words and I asked you to decide, which of these words apply to you and which of these words don't apply to you as a person, right? That's the kind of task that would increase, be above baseline activity in the default mode network. And there are other components to this, even such as questions of identity. I mean, a lot of that is in whole or in part mediated by the default mode. And this is what becomes noticeably quiescent when you are successfully practicing mindfulness, and it becomes quiescent in those experiences with psychedelics, where this sense of self is transcended for a time.
And where linguistic communication often becomes extremely difficult.
Yeah, yeah. But people experience. But so what's interesting here is that I think people, ordinary people who do not take psychedelics and who have no interest in meditation, do experience interruptions in this sense of self a lot that just go unrecognized. And sometimes they go recognized because they're so-called peak experiences or flow experiences where, they'll even the kinds of experiences you referenced, looking up at the Milky Way, the most beautiful encounter with a starry night you have, in that decade, say. You've gone to the place where there's the least light pollution and you've got, a cloudless, moonless night, and then you point your gaze skyward and you get the full experience. That's, there are two experiences people tend to have when they have sought out a peak experience like that. If they're lucky, they really have something like a moment where they're lifted out of themselves and they can just have something like this breathtaking encounter with nature, right? And then all too often that lasts, a second and a half, and then they're just talking about it and thinking about it and trying to get back to it, but they're still just jabbering to themselves and to whoever's with them, very likely, trying to get a hold of this thing where if you took mushrooms or if you took acid in that circumstance, well, then your linguistic, efforts to get this thing in hand are completely blown over, and you have the full, multi-hour encounter with the thing itself, right? And it's, that's what's so amazing about psychedelics is that whoever you are, let's leave aside the prospect of having a bad trip, which we about which many interesting things can be said. The so-called good trip you can have on mushrooms or LSD is this condition of the data of your senses, and in particular, in a circumstance like the one you described, your engagement with the natural world becomes so vivid, so salient, that the boundary between self and world is completely overcome. Right. So and the energetics of all of that suddenly becomes very salient. So it's not just like you're no longer representing yourself.
Also the consequences, Griffith's work. And if someone has a mystical experience on psilocybin and they're smokers, they stop 75% of the time.
Yeah.
It's like it lifts them so far out of themselves that even their addictions lift.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That's quite something. You talk about being possessed by that default network. Well, to be possessed by an addiction, like a nicotine addiction, is something like that gone wild. Yeah. And nonetheless, going there apparently has this transformative capacity. You also see the same thing with treatment for alcoholics. For years, alcohol researchers have known that the only reliable treatment for alcoholism is spiritual transformation. And that's hard-nosed empirical researchers have been wrestling with that for a long time.
Well, it gives you the sense that, again, I'm not claiming that the beatific vision that one has on LSD or psilocybin is necessarily the true target state of one's spiritual life. It's in some ways I think it's not. There's something misleading about it, but at a minimum, this end of the continuum of positive experience, just being flooded with bliss and completely overcome with an encounter with the present moment and meaning, just the perception of meaning, whether that meaning can be rationally justified in the end, right? Because literally you can, if you're in the right state of mind, it doesn't matter what you're looking at. It doesn't have to be the Milky Way. You can just be staring at a puddle in the concrete in a parking lot, and all of a sudden that is the answer to the mystery of existence, right? So in some ways, it's potentially there's a place to stand where you can pathologize this this hierophany of meaning. But leaving that aside, leaving that criticism aside, the experience itself proves beyond any possibility of doubt that it's possible to have an utterly transformative, and totally satisfying encounter with the present moment that isn't itself dependent on anything happening. It's a quality of your attention. Now, neurochemically, that's something obviously has to happen in order to allow you to pay attention that fully to anything. But there is a way of granting your attention to the present moment so that the sacredness of anything comes fully into view.